Snow fell in soft, relentless flakes upon the cobbled streets of London, frosting the edges of carriages and top hats alike, painting the night with a pale, indifferent light. The city had dressed itself in celebration. Gas lamps glimmered against frost-laden windows, laughter spilled from gilded doors, and the strains of a distant orchestra teased the winter air. Yet within the grand hall of the Wentworth estate, where candles burned like captured stars and crystal chandeliers trembled with reflected brilliance, there was one presence the night seemed almost determined to ignore. She stood at the entrance, her gloved hands tight around a small purse, her shoulders squared as though steel could ward off the whispers already gathering. Her gown, modest in cut but made of soft cream silk, caught the candlelight in quiet ripples, refusing to announce her arrival with the brazen flourish of those better connected. The men and women who passed gave her the occasional glance, brief and polite, though each carried the unspoken calculation: too plain, too late, too solitary. The murmurs, barely audible, hung in the air like a frost. "A table if you please," she said, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. A simple request, unremarkable in sound, yet it drew a wave of glances. Some were sharp, some polite, all measured. "I'm terribly sorry, madam," said a young attendant, bowing with practiced civility. "We are fully booked." She nodded once, a brief dip of her chin, and turned slightly to scan the room again. Another table, if it existed, was invisible. She felt the weight of the hall's eyes, the weight of every empty chair that might have held her, the weight of every whispered speculation about a woman alone, unpaired, uncoupled by design or misfortune. Even in the throng of festivity she felt reduced to a single note of absence, a melody that echoed but did not resonate. A lady in violet silk passed, glancing at her with the faintest curl of derision at the corner of her lips. "One wonders," she murmured to her companion, though not softly enough, "how she dares to present herself tonight." The words, though delivered with delicate poise, landed with the precision of an icicle. The heroine felt it prick her skin, cold and immediate. Yet she remained, chin lifted, hands folded around the purse as though it were the last remnant of her dignity. The air was thick with the scent of roses and melting wax, the heavy perfume of wealth and social expectation. Each step she took, tentative but firm, carried her deeper into a labyrinth of scrutiny. The orchestra's crescendo filled the room, a swelling tide of violins and horns, and in the midst of it, her heartbeat sounded louder than all else, an unmeasured drum against the polished marble. A group of young men paused to look her over, their laughter careful yet sharp. "She must be lost," one whispered. "Surely no one attends alone at such an hour." Their words, though cloaked in jest, cut deeper than any open insult. She bowed her head slightly, aware that any outward defense would only draw attention to the very isolation they assumed. Her solitude was her armor, though tonight she wondered if armor could withstand the cold precision of social judgment. The maitre d' approached with a rigid bow. His expression was neutral, yet there was no mistaking the message in his eyes. "Here there is no welcome." "Madam," he said, voice polite and detached, "all tables are presently reserved. I fear I cannot accommodate you." She inhaled, a quiet, deliberate breath, trying to summon patience from the well of her pride. To ask again would be audacious, to leave now would be humiliation. She lingered at the periphery, silent, a shadow beneath the glittering chandeliers, and she watched the world unfold without her. Men raising glasses, women gliding in silks, laughter spilling into corners she could not reach. She imagined herself swept along with them, a phantom tracing the contours of joy that she was denied. A child's laughter, a brief, careless sound, cut through the orchestral swell, reminding her of summers long past when the world seemed simpler and less exacting. She remembered the quiet afternoons in a garden, the simple comfort of a book in hand, the gentle insistence of sun upon her skin. Those days had long since receded into memory, buried beneath the relentless tides of expectation and exclusion. Tonight, she felt the absence of those moments like a tangible weight pressing upon her shoulders. Her gaze fell upon a table at the far end of the hall. It was round, polished, surrounded by chairs gleaming in candlelight, yet it remained obstinately empty. She stepped forward, a small, careful movement, as if proximity might grant her permission. The waiter shook his head ever so slightly, the seat remained out of reach. A murmur passed among the women nearby, soft speculation like wind rustling the silk of a gown, but the outcome was already written in the precision of their judgment. She did not belong. The cold seeped through her gloves as she straightened once more. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes, dark pools beneath the glow of chandeliers, reflected neither despair nor surrender, but quiet determination. She would not vanish silently into the night. She would endure, if only as witness to the world's gaiety, even if it refused her welcome. Then, without warning, without ceremony, a sharp scrape echoed across the marble. A chair shifted in the distance, the sound arresting in its clarity, slicing through murmurs and music alike. Heads turned, curiosity and surprise mingling with judgment. She froze, heart lurching. The hall seemed to hold its breath, the chandeliers trembling imperceptibly, as though the room itself awaited revelation. Her eyes lifted, catching a figure standing across the hall. He was tall, composed, with the measured authority of one accustomed to command. His gaze fell upon her with an intensity that was at once startling and oddly comforting. The murmurs faltered, the laughter waned, and in that brief, suspended moment she sensed a shift, a single, unspoken promise hovering in the space between them. The snow outside continued to fall, oblivious, covering London in pale, silent expectation. And in the grand hall, amidst candlelight and whispered judgment, she realized that tonight, perhaps, she would not leave entirely unseen. The scrape of the chair had scarcely settled when the figure across the hall moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. The Duke, tall and commanding, his dark coat gleaming beneath the chandelier's light, began to cross the polished marble floor. Each step seemed measured, a quiet assertion of authority, yet it carried no arrogance, only purpose. The murmurs fluttered like startled birds through the hall. Conversations paused mid-laughter, wine glasses tilted in suspended surprise. All eyes, drawn by instinct and curiosity alike, followed his progress. She remained rooted where she stood, hands clenched loosely, pulse hammering in a rhythm that matched the swelling music. She knew the stories that trailed his reputation, refined, distant, a figure of both admiration and caution. He was a man of high birth, accustomed to wielding influence with a mere glance. And now, in a moment that would surely ignite whispers for months, he was coming toward her. The air between them seemed to tighten, carrying with it the scent of burning wax and roses, the mingling of cold snow outside and warm candlelight within. He stopped at a careful distance, just enough to be seen without invading her space. His eyes, sharp and discerning, held hers with an intensity that unsettled and captivated all at once. "Madam," he said, voice low but resonant, carrying across the room without the need to raise it, "will you join me?" A collective murmur rippled through the hall. Some guests faltered in their movements, fingers pausing mid-toast, while others leaned subtly closer, straining to catch her reaction. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their silent judgments pressing against her spine like cold iron. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, an invitation that defied propriety, a gesture so audacious it felt almost reckless. Her lips parted, scarcely aware of the breath she drew, and she inclined her head with the utmost restraint. I would be honored," she murmured, her voice steadier than she felt. The words, soft and deliberate, carried a resonance she could not have anticipated. The Duke nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement that somehow held the force of a declaration. Without further hesitation, he gestured toward a table at the center of the hall, its polished surface gleaming in the candlelight, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The room reacted as though struck by a sudden gust of wind. Whispers cascaded from one group to another, some scandalized, some fascinated. "Did he?" a lady in lavender asked, her voice quivering with restrained outrage. "Invite her? Truly?" Her companion's eyes widened, nodding in disbelief, yet a faint spark of admiration flickered beneath the disapproval. The murmurs carried with them the weight of centuries-old rules, the invisible hand of societal expectation, and the audacity of one man daring to defy them. The Duke extended his arm, subtle but commanding, guiding her toward the table. The attendants paused, uncertain whether to intervene, yet their hesitation only underscored the unusualness of the moment. She moved forward with careful steps, each one a negotiation between fear and hope, until she reached the chair he had pulled back for her. It was a small act, seemingly mundane, yet it carried a weight of consideration that made the hall itself lean in to observe. Once seated, she became acutely aware of the attention surrounding them. Servants hovered just beyond, careful not to intrude, while guests whispered behind fans and gloved hands. The Duke seated himself opposite her, maintaining a calm dignity that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the room. He ordered her favorite wine without inquiry, as though he had anticipated her taste from some private knowledge, a gesture that startled her more than any public display could. The wine arrived in crystal glasses that caught the chandelier's brilliance, sending shards of light across the table like fleeting promises. She lifted the glass with trembling fingers, aware that each sip, each subtle tilt of her head, was observed and interpreted. Yet the Duke's gaze remained steady, unwavering, an anchor in the storm of scrutiny. "You seem unsurprised," he remarked quietly, leaning just enough to allow her to hear without others listening. "Do you often meet the world with such composure?" "I have no choice," she replied softly. "The world rarely grants mercy to those who linger unnoticed." Her words, though quiet, carried a depth that made him regard her more closely. In her tone, he discerned both resilience and the quiet ache of repeated dismissal, a life honed in shadows, yet craving recognition. He offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that hinted at private understanding. "Recognition then shall be afforded tonight," he said, his voice a low thread woven into the fabric of candlelight and whispered scandal. He reached across the table not for her hand, but to leave a small, significant token upon it. A gold signet ring, simple yet unmistakably his. It was a subtle declaration, a promise of attention and protection, and a challenge to those who doubted the propriety of their association. The whispers grew sharper. Some faces hardened in disapproval, while others leaned forward in fascination. A rival noblewoman in deep burgundy turned her back, lips pressed in thin, disdainful lines, yet the tilt of her head betrayed curiosity she could not fully suppress. The hall, so accustomed to ritual and expectation, had shifted imperceptibly, and the force of that shift emanated from the quiet defiance of one man and the measured acceptance of the woman he had chosen to honor. The orchestra swelled, and for a moment, the music seemed to bow around them, carrying with it the echo of a world both cruel and magnificent. Her pulse slowed slightly, the tension within her easing as she realized she was no longer merely present, no longer a shadow at the edges of celebration. She was noticed, not with pity, but with intention. As the clock in the hall ticked closer to midnight, a hush settled over the assembly. Candles flickered in rhythm with the distant chime of bells, the golden glow reflecting in her eyes, wide and uncertain. He leaned forward slightly so that only she could hear, and spoke words that seemed to rise above the scrutiny of all others. "You look as though you expect this kindness to vanish. It will not." The statement, simple in its phrasing, carried an unspoken weight. It was promise and defiance intertwined, a gesture that would echo far beyond the walls of the hall. She lifted her gaze to meet his, understanding, truly understanding, for the first time in her life, that the night could hold possibility, and that the world might, after all, bend toward those who dared to claim it. And in that suspended moment, as candles trembled and whispers fluttered like trapped birds, she sensed that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The hum of the hall faded as they moved into a narrow antechamber tucked behind velvet drapes, away from the heat of chandeliers and the murmur of judgment. Here, the firelight fell in gentle pools upon polished wood, casting flickering shadows that danced across their faces and softened the sharp angles of the world outside. She exhaled a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding, the tension of the evening loosening ever so slightly, though her pulse remained vigilant. The Duke gestured toward a high-backed chair near the hearth, and she seated herself with cautious grace, aware that every movement was a declaration in miniature. He remained standing, one hand resting lightly upon the mantel, his gaze never leaving her. The heat of the fire brushed their profiles with a golden warmth, a private intimacy that contrasted sharply with the scrutiny of the hall from which they had just escaped. It was a moment that seemed to exist apart from time itself, suspended between the obligations of society and the fragile possibility of understanding. "You carry yourself as though the world has grown heavy upon your shoulders," he said quietly, the words measured, deliberate, yet imbued with curiosity rather than judgment. His tone invited confession, though it demanded courage to take the first step. She lowered her gaze, hands clasped tightly in her lap, and for a moment, silence stretched between them like a fragile bridge over uncertain waters. "I have learned," she said finally, her voice soft yet unwavering, "that to be unseen is safer than to be noticed. The world takes liberties with those it deems unimportant, and I have long ago surrendered to its indifference." She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his with a mixture of defiance and fatigue. "It is not bravery but necessity that has guided me to this point." He regarded her with a keen attentiveness, as though each word were a gem to be weighed and understood. "And yet," he replied, his voice carrying the subtle cadence of someone accustomed to listening beyond words, "here you stand in the center of scrutiny, bearing it with composure most would envy. There is courage in this, though it is veiled beneath restraint." The observation, simple and quiet, landed with the weight of recognition. She felt a tremor of something she had long suppressed, a mixture of relief and disbelief. To be seen, truly seen, by one accustomed to observation and judgment, was a sensation at once exhilarating and terrifying. "I have known little else," she murmured, "and I have grown practiced in the art of invisibility. Yet, it does not prevent one from longing for acknowledgment, however fleeting." The Duke's expression softened imperceptibly. He took a step closer but did not intrude upon her space. "Acknowledgment," he said thoughtfully, "is a dangerous gift when given indiscriminately. It exposes both the giver and the receiver to scrutiny and expectation. Yet it is also the only currency worth possessing." He paused, his eyes lingering on her face as though attempting to memorize the contours of a lifetime spent in careful concealment. The firelight flickered against the polished mantel, throwing long shadows that stretched toward them like tentative bridges. She sensed the vulnerability in her own confession, the raw edge of honesty that threatened both pride and composure. And yet, in the presence of the Duke, it felt less perilous, as though his attentiveness offered a protective sheath against the world's sharp edges. "I have spent years learning the rules," she said quietly, "the subtle dance of expectation and avoidance. To step beyond them is perilous. But tonight it seems I am afforded some measure of choice. I am permitted to exist not merely as a shadow, but as someone recognized." Her fingers traced the edge of the table, a nervous gesture that spoke of restraint and desire alike. He moved slightly closer, resting one hand upon the back of the chair nearest her. "Recognition," he said, voice low and resonant, "is not given lightly and it cannot be feigned. I offer it because I see, not because society commands me to act. It is a rare thing, and I ask that you accept it not as favor but as truth." There was a gravity in his tone that made her inhale sharply. She understood the weight of his words. They carried not obligation but genuine attention, a rarity she had scarcely imagined in her life. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken possibilities. She met his gaze, and in the depths of his eyes she found a mirror of her own hidden longings, restraint mingled with desire, observation tempered by understanding. "It is astonishing," she whispered, "to be seen without pretense or judgment, to be chosen in such a deliberate manner." Her voice faltered slightly, betraying the depth of emotion she had long buried beneath years of careful composure. He inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgment of both her words and her courage. "Choice is seldom ours in society," he murmured, "yet it remains the most precious possession we can claim. I offer it freely, though I do not presume you will take it lightly. I offer recognition, and I leave it to you to determine how it will shape what comes next." Her chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate rhythm, her mind racing through a lifetime of careful avoidance and solitary endurance. In his presence, the walls she had built around herself seemed both necessary and fragile, strong enough to protect yet porous enough to allow a glimmer of possibility. For the first time in years she contemplated not mere survival, but the shaping of her own narrative within the constraints of expectation and society's gaze. The crackle of the fire punctuated the silence, each spark a reminder of warmth in the midst of shadow. She felt a stirring of something long dormant, a fragile hope, delicate as spun glass, yet luminous. Her fingers tightened briefly around the edge of her gown, grounding herself in the reality of presence, of choice, of acknowledgement. I do not know what comes next," she admitted, voice barely above the whisper of the flames, "but I understand that tonight has changed the shape of possibility. I have been seen, and I will carry this with me, however cautiously, into whatever awaits." The Duke's gaze softened into something almost imperceptibly tender. "Then let this night mark not merely survival, but the beginning of understanding. We are seldom afforded such moments, yet when they arrive, they are impossible to forget." He paused, and in the quiet, intimate space between them she sensed the weight of both promise and peril, the tenuous thread of connection that might either unravel or endure. The hall beyond remained a world of scrutiny, judgment, and expectation, but in this small, shadowed chamber, they were removed from its tyranny. Firelight and whispered acknowledgement became their sanctuary, fragile yet unyielding, a place where the past could be confronted and the future, however uncertain, tentatively imagined. A soft knock at the door startled her, reminding them both that the world waited just beyond the drapes, its attention and judgment inevitable. She met his eyes, and in that shared glance she understood. Whatever followed, she would not face it alone, and the courage to exist openly had been granted, however delicately, for the first time in her life. The knock persisted, insistent yet polite, and he inclined his head toward the door. She rose slowly, the firelight tracing her silhouette, and for a brief heartbeat the world held its breath. Tonight had begun with isolation, and yet, as she crossed the threshold of the antechamber, she realized that the world might now contain a space where recognition, choice, and courage could coexist, if only for the next moment. The night of the New Year's ball arrived with a hush of anticipation, London cloaked in frost and lantern glow, streets gleaming like black glass beneath the snow. Carriages rattled over cobbles, brass lanterns swinging, while muffled music and laughter spilled through tall windows into the chill. Within the grand hall of the Wentworth estate, every chandelier sparkled as though eager to witness the unfolding of whispered scandal and restrained expectation. Guests moved in careful patterns, their gowns and coats a riot of silk and velvet, while the air hung thick with perfume, candle smoke, and subtle tension. She arrived with a measured composure, her cloak drawn tight against the cold, her gloves pale against the bouquet she carried. Eyes turned as she stepped into the hall, not merely at her modest elegance, but because the Duke had already preceded her arrival, his presence commanding space in a way that made both whispers and gazes bend toward him. The murmurs of previous evenings had followed her here, but they were tempered now by curiosity and speculation. Would he, a man of such station, openly acknowledge her presence again? Her heart thrummed in quiet rhythm, each beat a negotiation between fear and hope. She felt the weight of expectation, the judgment of hundreds, the scrutiny that had haunted her for years. And yet, as her eyes scanned the room, she saw him. The Duke stood near the orchestra, composed, unyielding, a figure both resolute and magnetic. The moment their gazes met, something shifted in the hall's atmosphere, a subtle ripple that carried across marble and velvet. He was coming toward her, and this time the gesture would not be hidden in quiet corridors or whispered halls. She felt the first flutter of panic, quickly tempered by the memory of their conversation by the fire, the acknowledgement, the recognition, the quiet promise that had lingered in her mind since that night. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and allowed herself to step forward, navigating the maze of glittering guests who parted subtly, uncertain, their curiosity and censure mingling. Every glance she received felt sharper than the chill outside, yet somehow more manageable because it was tempered by the knowledge that she would not face it alone. The Duke moved deliberately, a calm certainty in every measured step. His gaze never wavered, and as he crossed the expanse of the hall, whispers collided with one another, some thick with astonishment, others edged with admiration. A lady in emerald silk stiffened in recognition, her fan pressed against her chest as though to shield herself from the audacity she observed. The orchestra faltered in their rhythm, if only for a heartbeat, as though the music itself awaited the unfolding of a social revolution, delicate and precise. When he reached her, the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. He extended a hand, not timidly, but with the quiet authority of one accustomed to command. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the assembly, "may I present you as my companion this evening?" The words, simple in form yet monumental in implication, hung in the air, heavy with both social risk and personal declaration. A ripple passed through the hall. Some guests stiffened in polite shock, others leaned forward, their curiosity impossible to contain. The rival noblewoman in deep burgundy lowered her fan slowly, her lips pressed tight, and yet a spark of begrudging intrigue glimmered in her eyes. Gasps and whispered exclamations threaded through the throng, but the Duke's composure remained unshaken, a pillar of quiet authority amidst the stir of speculation. She felt a heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and disbelief. This was no longer a private acknowledgement. It was a declaration in full view of the social world she had long navigated with careful invisibility. And yet, as she lifted her gaze to meet his, she felt a strange sense of liberation, a fragile courage blooming in the space between recognition and audacity. "Come if you will," he said, bowing his head just slightly, the subtle gesture carrying more weight than any flourish could. She allowed herself to take his arm, their fingers brushing, not in intimacy, but in the silent assertion of partnership. Together they moved through the hall, and with every step she became aware of the shifting currents around them, the awe, the intrigue, the quiet resistance of society encountering defiance tempered with dignity. The orchestra resumed, its melody swelling in response to the momentum of the evening, and they approached a table in the center of the hall. The Duke guided her gently, the world around them vibrating with the tension of expectation. She seated herself with careful poise, and he followed, taking his place opposite her with a grace that seemed to silence both murmurs and musings. Servants hovered at a respectful distance, hesitant to intrude upon what had become a moment of personal and social gravity. He regarded her for a moment, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips. "Tonight," he said quietly, will be remembered not for the splendor of the hall or the brilliance of our attire, but for the courage to acknowledge what is true and rare. His gaze held hers with unwavering steadiness, and she felt a resonance deep within, a recognition of both herself and the rare generosity of a man who refused to bow entirely to convention. The candles flickered, casting shadows that danced across their faces, and she realized that the hall's scrutiny had transformed. It was no longer a weapon aimed at her, but a backdrop against which their defiance, delicate yet unmistakable, played out. The weight of expectation pressed upon them, yes, but so too did the exhilarating possibility of rewriting the rules of observation and acknowledgement. As they spoke in quiet undertones, laughter and music continuing around them like a distant tide, she sensed that the social world had shifted imperceptibly, the edges of judgment softened by the clarity of his choice. No longer invisible, no longer merely present, she felt herself becoming a participant in the evening's unfolding, a figure both noticed and honored, and yet acutely aware that the future remained uncertain, fragile, and full of possibility. And then, as the clock struck near midnight, a servant approached to announce the arrival of guests still awaiting introductions. The Duke's eyes flickered toward her, and in that brief glance she recognized the unspoken question. Would she continue to claim this newfound space of recognition, or retreat into the shadows that had once been her refuge? The murmurs of the hall, the clinking of glasses, and the soft rustle of silk seemed to pause in collective anticipation. She lifted her gaze, meeting his with a courage she had scarcely imagined, and felt the fragile, luminous spark of possibility take root. Tonight had begun with isolation, yet now it brimmed with bold declaration, and the world itself seemed to wait for her response. The carriage wheels crunched over the frost-kissed streets of London, each rotation punctuating the fragile quiet of the early morning. The city, still glittering from the celebrations, was now hushed, as though it had paused to witness a moment too delicate to be rushed. Inside the carriage, she sat with her gloved hands folded upon her lap, the warmth of the fur-lined seat a small comfort against the lingering chill of the night. Beside her, the Duke's presence was a constant reassurance, not through proximity alone, but through the weight of assurance that radiated from him in measured, deliberate waves. She had not spoken since leaving the hall, not out of fear, but because her thoughts were a torrent she had no words to organize. Recognition, acknowledgement, courage, these abstract gifts he had offered her now pressed against her chest like tangible entities. She felt a strange blend of exhilaration and trepidation, the kind that comes when one realizes that life, long constrained by expectation and timidity, may finally bend toward possibility. The Duke's hand rested lightly upon the edge of the seat, not touching, not commanding, yet undeniably present. "You carry much with you," he said at last, his voice a low thread of warmth, "and yet I believe you are beginning to understand that the world need not define your value. Only you may do so." His eyes, dark and deliberate, met hers with a gravity that seemed to weigh the entirety of her past, the silent endurance, the invisible struggles, the moments of quiet despair, and yet held them lightly, without reproach. She inclined her head, lips parting slightly, and for a moment, her voice seemed to falter, as though the weight of centuries of social expectation sought to silence her entirely. I have long lived in shadows," she murmured, "and the light, when it touches me, is both terrifying and overwhelming. I am unpracticed in such acknowledgement, yet I feel its force as one feels the wind before a storm." The Duke's lips curved in a faint smile, not of condescension but of recognition, the kind that reassures without diminishing. "Then allow the wind to guide you," he said softly, "and know that I will not let it strike without defense. Tonight we stand not against the world but alongside it, careful, yes, but unyielding in our truth." She exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she was holding, and allowed herself to imagine the possibility of partnership, of choice, of claim over her own life. The carriage swayed gently over the frozen stones, and for a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had granted reprieve. By the time the carriage reached the Duke's family estate, the first pale light of dawn had begun to filter through the sky. The grounds, meticulously landscaped, were dusted with snow, each path and fountain catching the morning light with crystalline clarity. He guided her from the carriage with the same deliberate grace he had exhibited throughout the night, and she followed, heart pounding, aware that the true test awaited them within the stone walls of his ancestral home. The door opened with a crisp creak, and immediately they were met with the formidable presence of his mother. Tall, austere, and unyielding, her gaze swept over the pair like a judgment rendered in steel. She was a woman of precise observation, capable of detecting truth and deception alike, and the slightest misstep in demeanor or tone could incur a weight of disapproval that might crush the unprepared. The air between them was taut with expectation, every particle vibrating with the anticipation of reckoning. "Mother," the Duke said calmly, his voice a shield as much as a bridge, "allow me to introduce my companion. She has been recognized, chosen, and stands here by her own merit." His words were careful, deliberate, yet they carried the force of command tempered by respect. The matriarch's eyes flicked to her, sharp and calculating, before returning to the Duke. "I have observed much," she said, voice crisp and deliberate, "and I expect even more. Who are you that you would step so boldly into our world?" Her gaze pinned the heroine with the weight of centuries of tradition, a test both unspoken and inexorable. The heroine straightened, lifting her chin with a composure that had carried her through years of social invisibility. "I am a woman accustomed to the world's indifference, madam," she said evenly, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I have learned to survive, to endure, and to respect the spaces into which I am permitted to enter. Yet I also believe that courage and dignity may command notice where mere pedigree would not." The Duke's mother regarded her in silence, the room hanging on the stillness, the flickering firelight reflecting off polished floors and high ceilings. There was a subtle shift in the matriarch's posture, the faintest acknowledgement that the courage she observed was genuine, the quiet defiance tempered by grace. The tension, sharp and formidable only moments before, softened imperceptibly, like ice cracking under a deliberate warmth. "Very well," the mother said at last, her tone measured, yet no longer fully cold. "You may remain here tonight, and be judged not solely by whispers and rumor, but by the steadiness with which you present yourself." There was no overt warmth in her words, yet in their precision lay a grudging respect, an acknowledgement of survival through intelligence, courage, and decorum. The heroine exhaled softly, a wave of relief and triumph mingling. She had met the greatest challenge of the evening and had not faltered. It was a small victory, yet monumental within the private architecture of her life, a testament to dignity preserved against the encroaching weight of judgment. The Duke extended his arm subtly, and she took it, not as a plea for protection, but as an unspoken affirmation of partnership. Together they moved through the halls, the matriarch's eyes following them with measured attention. In each step, each shared glance, they claimed not rebellion for its own sake, but a quiet, dignified defiance that neither spectacle nor gossip could diminish. Later, in the stillness of the estate's gardens, she allowed herself to breathe in the crisp winter air, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The first tendrils of dawn painted the horizon in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in years she felt that the world was both vast and intimate, capable of grandeur without erasing individuality. The Duke stood beside her, quiet and attentive, his eyes reflecting both the warmth of the fire they had left behind and the promise of mornings yet to come. "I offer you," he said softly, "not the illusion of safety, nor the fleeting attention of novelty, but recognition and choice. The life we inhabit will not always be free from judgment, yet we may navigate it together, deliberate in our defiance and steadfast in our truth." His words settled around her like a cloak, protective and unyielding, yet suffused with quiet intimacy. She looked to him, eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude and dawning hope. "I accept," she whispered, voice trembling with the delicate weight of emotion, "not because I require rescue, but because I recognize in you a kindred measure of resolve. Together, we may endure what has hitherto demanded solitude and compromise." For a moment they stood in silence, the snow settling gently around them, a hush over the estate as though the world itself had paused to witness acknowledgment forged in courage and truth. She felt the culmination of months, perhaps years, of invisible struggle, the quiet battles of endurance and dignity, crystallizing into a singular luminous moment of choice. The Duke took her hand, lightly at first, then with a gentle firmness, and she allowed the contact, feeling in it a blend of trust, respect, and quiet exhilaration. No words were necessary. The connection conveyed volumes, a testament to the understanding that had grown through firelight, whispers, and careful observation. They returned to the warmth of the estate, the halls no longer intimidating but filled with potential. The staff, guests, and even the matriarch observed their passage with a mixture of curiosity and subdued respect. Each glance, each subtle acknowledgement, reinforced what had been quietly declared, that recognition and courage, when combined with dignity, could not be denied, even within the strictures of society. At last, they stood before the hearth in the principal chamber, where the first rays of morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long, gentle beams across the polished floors. The world outside was waking, yet here, in the intimacy of the estate's heart, a private reality had been forged. They were no longer bound solely by expectation or fear. They were companions in acknowledgement, partners in choice, and custodians of a delicate but enduring defiance. The heroine turned toward the Duke, eyes bright, voice steady despite the thrum of exhilaration in her chest. "Whatever awaits," she said softly, "I shall meet it, not with trepidation, but with the assurance that I am neither unseen nor unremarkable." He inclined his head, a faint, approving smile curving his lips. "And I shall be beside you as witness, as partner, and as steadfast companion. For courage and dignity, once recognized, are too rare to be ignored and too precious to surrender." Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent, blanketing London in white, serene and unyielding. Inside, a single fire burned warmly, a symbol of both shelter and revelation. And as the first bells of the morning tolled across the city, marking not only the passing of night but the promise of new beginnings, they stood together, unshaken and resolute, the culmination of patience, courage and quiet, deliberate choice. The world would continue to watch, to judge, to whisper, but they had carved a space within it that was theirs alone. A space defined not by fear or expectation, but by acknowledgement, mutual respect, and the fragile, luminous courage of hearts long restrained, now finally unbound.